Hi, I'm Adam Jones, the COO at Simultrans, the localization company. We often hear from customers and prospects, what is translation memory? So we've created this video to give you a definition of translation memory and let you know some of the benefits that you can gain from using it for your localization projects.
In essence, translation memory is a database of translations usually created by human translators. The translators pair the English text that they're translating along with the translations that they enter in the target languages, and these then get stored so that they can be reused later on when the same source language text appears. Translation memory is not machine translation. It's not used for creating the translation by the computer from scratch. It's also not a glossary of terms. Often translators might identify certain terms that are very specific to a product in English, research and translate those into the target languages to create a glossary. Translation memory usually doesn't contain individual words that you would find in a glossary, but rather longer segments of text like sentences. The main purpose of creating translation memory is to allow you to reuse previously translated text. And so that could be in the form of product updates. If, for example, you release a product today and then 6 months down the road you make an update to that same product, some of the text might change. But instead of translating the entire content again, you can just translate the new information. Even if words move around in the source language, they can still be relied on and used from the translation memory. You can also reuse previously translated text for similar products or documents. So for example, if you have an enterprise version of a product and you've translated the content for that, and then you release a consumer version of the same product, you can hopefully reuse some of that enterprise translation where text has been duplicated. The main advantage of translation memory is to save money. By reusing translations, you can pay just once to translate each segment of text and not have to keep paying for that same information to be translated every time an update is made or another similar product is released. It also allows you to speed up schedules, particularly for updates, since the entire content does not need to be translated again. And finally, it improves consistency, ensuring translators refer to the same steps in the same way every time. The main building block of translation memory is the segment of text. And segments of text can be a variety of different things. You can see a list here. It might be a sentence, which is probably the most common segment type and usually what you would find in documentation. But it could also be an item in a bullet point list. It could be a chapter heading. Software strings are stored as segments of text, so a menu item or a button on a dialog box or a string with some error message. Could be a help topic, or even a graphic callout with text identifying a portion of a graphic. Here are a few examples of the types of source content you might find in a segment of text. Something like print setup from a menu, or a longer type of message that you would see either in software or a sentence of documentation. Translation memory is usually created by specialized tools used by the localization industry to create it. Here are some examples, such as Trados, which is probably the most long-lived and widely used translation memory tool, and also some of the newer server-based tools like WorldServer and Across. After the translation is completed, you can also align translations to create translation memory, though sometimes that's a bit trickier because you have to match up every sentence of the source language text with the sentence of the translated text. So of course the translator would still need to be involved in that process. These are just a few examples of translation memory tools, and there are many more that can create translation memory. For example, there's some software-specific tools like Catalyst or Pasolo that are used to allow translators to work in context with user interface files and also store those in a memory so they can be reused for updates. Increasingly, we're seeing server-based tools being more widely used for creation of translation memory, and that's because they often automate many of the process steps that make projects go more smoothly. For example, in the comparison you see here, you can see that the server-based tools like WorldServer or Cross can automatically parse and leverage the files as soon as they're uploaded, and they also can provide access through a browser that's constantly updating the translation memory as the translators work. Finally, they make the review process easier because your reviewers in the target countries would be able to log in and look at the translated information and then either add comments or actually modify the translation depending on what rights you want to give them in the permission settings. We still see Trados and other desktop tools used fairly frequently, especially if a lot of translation memory has been built up in those tools. While you can usually convert memory from one tool to another, sometimes you do lose some of the leveraging when you do that. Here you can see the typical interface that translators might look at when they're completing the translation. This is the example of WorldServer Desktop Workbench, which is a standalone application that's part of WorldServer. As I mentioned on the previous slide, there's also a browser version of that, and then of course there are many other tools. All the tools have a fairly similar layout though, where you would see the source language content on one side, in this case English, and the target language content on the other, in this case German. And so the translator can then type the translation in that tool matched up with the correct segment of English text. You can see it codes the translations in different ways. For example, here highlighting in blue sentences that have been reused from the translation memory that the translator just needs to review, and green showing newly completed translations. In the case of the currently highlighted segment, there was not an exact match in the translation memory, so here the translators prompted in the auto search area on the bottom half of the screen for information that's similar in the translation memory. In this case, an extremely similar segment of text that's a 99.8% match. So it's probably going to be easy for the translator to use that segment and just make some minor modifications to match the current version of English. Translation memory is stored in a variety of file formats, and a lot of the server-based tools actually store the memory in a database, either Microsoft SQL or MySQL. In this case, you can see an example of a TMX file. TMX is an XML-based file format that's widely recognized as the industry standard for storing translation memory files. This TMX file can usually have thousands or hundreds of thousands even of units that are stored in the translation. So you can see here one example of a translation unit where it shows that segment of text in English and then the translation for that same segment in Spanish. Now that you understand the basics of translation memory, some next steps would be thinking about how to really optimize the use of memory, thinking about how the source files are formatted and parsed, what memory tools are best to use, the best format for storing the memory, and how to maximize the leveraging you get between documents. We have some seminars and webinars on that topic, and one day I might record a video on that as well. So feel free to call or email me if you have any questions. My email address and phone number here, and I and my colleagues at Simultrans are always happy to help. Thanks.